My name is Adua Okori. I was born in Benin City, Nigeria, but most of my adult life in darkness didn't happen there. It happened far from home, first in Accra, Ghana, and later in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm not here to motivate you. I'm not here to hype you. I'm not here to sell you prayers. I'm not here because there are psalms the rich know and psalms the poor ignore. And I learned that truth not in church, but inside witchcraft. I understand how that sounds. It makes people uncomfortable. Many of you have prayed Psalm 23 and you're still struggling. You've shouted Psalm 91 and still found yourself borrowing money. You've quoted Psalm 35 and your life hasn't moved the way you expected and you don't know why. I didn't know either at first, but inside the coven, we studied Christians very carefully. We knew which ones would remain poor for life, even though they loved God. We knew which ones would struggle endlessly, even while fasting. And we knew the small group that would eventually rise, break cycles, build wealth, and step out of poverty. It wasn't random, it never is. It followed a pattern. And that pattern was hidden inside the book of Psalms. Not all Psalms, but specific ones, read in specific seasons, at specific hours, for specific durations. I'm sharing this slowly because it matters. This kind of confession isn't dangerous to you, it's dangerous to the system I used to serve. So I'll take my time. I want you to understand how poverty can be enforced spiritually and how wealth is permitted. I joined the coven in 2009 after I relocated to Accra to stay with my aunt, Mrs. Eunice Mensah, in Medina Zongo. The woman who recruited me was called Auntie Abina. She owned a small provision shop. Nothing flashy, but she financed properties in East Legon and Tema. One day she asked me a question that stayed with me. She said, "Why do you think some Christians pray hard and still die poor?" I told her what most people would say. I said, "Maybe it's God's will." She laughed, not harshly, just knowingly. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "The spirit world does not reward noise, it responds to alignment." That was the first time I heard the phrase alignment prayer. That night, in a small room behind her shop, she opened a worn Bible, not a spell book, a Bible, and she showed me Psalms. We didn't mock, we feared them. That's when I learned something most people don't realize. That's when I learned something most people don't realize. Witches don't joke with sounds. Not every sound attracts money. Some sounds maintain poverty. In witchcraft, poverty isn't always caused by demons. Sometimes it's maintained by the wrong kind of spiritual engagement. Christians often love comforting sounds, but not all sounds are just comforting. Some are governmental. They speak to systems, to gates, to territories, to permissions. And in the coven, we categorize sounds carefully: protective sounds, judgment sounds, alignment sounds, provision sounds, dominion sounds. Most Christians stay in the first category. The ones who become rich spiritually and financially don't stay there. There was one psalm in particular that separated things clearly for us. The psalm that caused the most concern wasn't Psalm 23 or Psalm 91. It was Psalm 120. That surprised me at the time. But when you listen closely, you begin to understand. Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord, that delighteth greatly in his commandments. Wealth and riches shall be in his house. You see, witches didn't hate the sound because it begged God. It didn't. It declared structure. And structure is something the spirit realm recognizes. But here's what many people miss. Psalm 112 is not something you read once and move on. It's a process psalm. It works through repetition and alignment. I saw this clearly later in Jonah Bisnan when I met a Zimbabwean businessman named Dendai Moyo. He wasn't part of the coven, he was a Christian. But we monitored him because his finances were unusually stable, almost untouchable. And what stood out wasn't something dramatic, it was something simple. He read Psalm 1 at 12 every morning for 40 days, always before speaking to anyone, always standing, always out loud. Now, that detail might seem small, but it isn't. In the spirit realm, posture carries meaning. Standing is a governmental posture. It signals intention, authority, awareness. Most poor Christians read Psalms sitting, lying down, distracted, sometimes emotional, sometimes rushed, but the people who rise tend to engage differently. They're in tension. They understand sequence and posture. Psalm 112 doesn't promise instant money. It doesn't create excitement or drama. It talks about generations, about structure, about memory, about permanence. Poverty tends to respond to emotion. Wealth responds to order. There was another psalm we paid attention to, especially at night. That was Psalm 128. It had to be read carefully. Blessed is everyone that feareth the Lord. Thou shalt eat the labor of thy hands. This psalm is what we called night activated. In the coven, we worked with night gates, especially between 11:45 p.m. and 1:15 a.m. when Christians unknowingly read Psalm 128 consistently during those hours. They interfered with monitoring systems. That's why some people pray at night and see no change. It's not always about effort. Sometimes it's about using the wrong sound at the wrong time. I remember in Lagos, there was a woman called Sister BC. She was a hairdresser, a single mother, always praying, always trying, always trying. A former occult member advised her quietly. He told her, Peace told her, PM 112 in the morning for 30 days, Psalm 128 at night for 21 days. No begging prayers, no complaint words. They, she followed it. No noise, just consistency. 6 months later, we couldn't track her patterns the same way. She opened a salon in Ikaja. 2 years later, she owned the building. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. It was steady. Consistency created what we understood as spiritual memory. Once the spirit realm recognizes a pattern of daily alignment. Certain forces simply disengage. If you read Psalms casually, you tend to remain average. If you read them emotionally, you may survive. But if you read them positionally, with understanding and consistency, something shifts over time. Poverty begins to lose its legal ground. It's not magic, it's closer to a system, a kind of law. The people who rise learn it and practice it. The people who struggle are often distracted from it. And when you look at it that way, the prayer becomes simple and clear. Lord, align my days with your order. Remove disorder from my spiritual life as I engage your word with understanding. Let poverty lose permission over my bloodline. That's the kind of prayer that follows understanding. I'm no longer part of the system I came from, but I won't pretend I didn't learn anything there. There are sounds the rich know, and sounds the poor ignore. And now, at least, you know where to begin. If you followed me this far, then you may already sense something. Most people don't notice until much later. Poverty is not always the absence of prayer. Sometimes it's the presence of disorder. Where I came from, we didn't waste energy. Every ritual had timing. Every word had placement. Every repetition had purpose. So when I left the coven and fully entered Christianity, what surprised me wasn't the scriptures. It was how casually many believers handled them, especially the Psalms. I've already shown you Psalm 112 and Psalm 128. Psalms of structure, inheritance, and labor reward. But there are other sounds, quieter ones, that we paid very close attention to. These are not commonly emphasized. They're rarely taught properly, and even more rarely practiced with consistency. Yet when a person aligns with them, something begins to change. Not instantly, but in a way that doesn't reverse easily. I learned this the hard way. Let me explain something plainly. In the spirit realm, money does not move randomly. It flows through what we understood as paths or channels. Some of those channels are inherited, some are opened intentionally, others are blocked. During my time in Pretoria, in an area called Pretoria West, I was assigned to a unit known as Economic Watch. Our assignment was simple in description, but precise in execution. We monitored Christians who showed signs of financial potential. We identified those approaching a breakthrough, and we interfered before their consistency matured. What alerted us most wasn't fasting or shouting or even church attendance, it was consistency. Consistent alignment with specific sounds. That's what drew attention. The first of these is Psalm 1. Most people read it once, maybe early in their faith, and then move on. But Psalm 1 is not just a prayer. I. Functions more like a filter. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. In the system I came from, this psalm helped determine who was even eligible for increase. Because wealth in that structure requires stability at the root. We were taught never to waste effort targeting someone who still operated in mixed counsel. They would undo themselves over time. No intervention needed. This psalm separates the advice you accept, the voices you listen to, the associations that influence your decisions. I remember a man in Cape Town in the Belleville area. His name was Chindu Okafor. He worked as an Uber driver, faithful in church, consistent in attendance, always praying, but financially stuck. The we observed him for years and didn't interfere. There was no need. At night, he would pray the Psalms, but during the day, he made financial decisions based on the wrong counsel. That contradiction was enough. Eventually, something shifted. He cut off three specific voices in his life: friends who mocked patience, who pushed him into debt, who dismissed steady growth. Once those influences were removed, his situation began to change. There was no dramatic prayer attached to it. It was a decision adjustment. And from our side, interest in him simply faded. The people who rise don't read Psalm 1 for emotion. They read it like a mirror. Quietly, often in the morning, they reflect and then they adjust their decisions. Psalm 1 isn't something you shout, it's something you obey. Many Christians declare it in the morning and disregard it by midday. Then there is Psalm 110. This one caused real concern where I came from. Sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. This is not a begging psalm, it's positional. It speaks about authority, about access, about timing. In that system, sitting represented rank. It represented where you operate from. Christians who engage Psalm 1 and 10 consistently begin to function differently. A, they rise above what I would call low level financial struggle. I remember a woman in London, originally from Ghana. Her name was Amabwabe. She worked as a cleaner, quiet, consistent, not someone who drew attention. But she read Psalm 110 every dawn for 90 days. She didn't fully understand what she was doing, but she stayed consistent. And something changed. Opportunities began to find her. Contracts came without her chasing them. Favor replaced effort in a noticeable way. We attempted to interfere, but nothing held. The situation had shifted beyond the level we could easily access. She had changed position, even without realizing it. Many people avoid Psalm 1 to 10 because it doesn't sound soft. It doesn't sound like what they think humility should be. But there's a difference between humility and powerlessness. Psalm 110 is direct. It assumes a position of authority. And systems like the one I came from take notice when someone understands where they are positioned. Then there is Psalm 35. This one is often misunderstood. Some avoid it because it sounds aggressive. But there's something important to understand. Poverty, in many cases, has enforcers. Psalm 35 addresses those enforcers. When someone engages it properly, it's not about anger, it's about legal confrontation. I remember in Kumasi, there was a trader known as Mama Fanke. Her business never seemed to grow. Profit would come in and then disappear. She was advised to read Psalm 35 on Wednesdays only, standing out loud for 14 weeks. No shouting, no emotional additions, just reading. By the ninth week, something shifted. The individual enforcing her stagnation fell ill and relocated. Her business didn't explode overnight. It simply started growing naturally. The resistance had been removed. What we feared most was that not loudness, it was alignment. When someone combined these patterns, P Psalm 1 for foundation, Psalm 1112 for structure, Psalm 128 for labor reward, Psalm 110 for position, and Psalm 35 for enforcement removal. Something happened that was difficult to counter. Poverty began to lose its access points. Structurally, legally, and territorially, we didn't concern ourselves with loud Christians. Noise was common. What we watched closely were those who aligned consistently. That's where change became difficult to reverse. So, if you take anything from this, keep it simple. Don't rush through these things. Don't skip days casually. Don't mix instruction with emotion. The Psalms were not written for entertainment. They function more like a governing system. If you read them as poetry, you may feel something. If you read them as law and apply them consistently, you begin to see a different kind of result. And over time, the difference between those who rise and those who remain stuck becomes clearer. It's not always about faith in the way people describe it. More often, it comes down to order. As I continued in that world, one thing became clearer to me. We didn't fear loud Christians. We feared aligned Christians, the ones who understood order, timing, and repetition were the ones who created real disruption in what we considered predictable outcomes. So, the instruction was always the same. Don't rush sounds. Don't skip structure. Don't mix emotion with instruction. In the environment I came from, we used to say something very simple, almost unsettling in hindsight. Give people motivation, but never give them structure because motivation fades. Structure changes outcomes over time. That was the difference we understood very early. Even now, after living that life, I can still see how that principle shows up everywhere. People want results, but they avoid systems. They want tie breaks, but they resist repetition. And that is where cycles continue without interruption. Let me say this clearly in my own words. I left witchcraft, but I did not forget its systems. I can no longer agree with its intent, but I cannot deny what I observed. There are patterns that repeat themselves when certain conditions are met and don't care about emotion. There are sounds the rich know and sounds the poor ignore. And once you see that clearly, you stop treating everything as random. When I was still inside the coven structure, I often watched how people reacted to instruction. Most people wanted something dramatic, something immediate, something emotional. But the system we operated in was never built around emotion. It was built around consistency and timing. At one point, I was stationed in an area I later understood as Pretoria West in Pretoria. There, we had what was called economic observation. Our work was not to create outcomes, but to observe patterns and interrupt consistency when it started forming too strongly. We were trained to recognize one thing above everything else, not prayer volume, not church activity, not fasting intensity, but sustained repetition over time. When someone maintained a pattern long enough, it created what we call spiritual memory. That idea stayed with me even after I left. There was an instructor in Midrand in Johannesburg who once said something I never forgot. He said anything sustained beyond 40 days begins to register as memory in the unseen structure people talk about in different ways. Whether you agree with the language or not, the principle was always about repetition creating permanence. That is why certain patterns were structured in phases. The first phase was what we call foundation alignment. It involved someone over a period of about 40 days. The instruction was simple. A. Early morning reading between roughly 5 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. standing with the text read out loud. No distractions, no emotional interaction, no casual engagement. The purpose was not performance, it was structure formation. In our observation, this phase affected decision making. It reduced internal confusion. It reorganized choices. It created a kind of stability in how people responded to life decisions. And from our perspective, when that happened, people became harder to influence in predictable ways. I remember a man in Abuja, a civil servant named Daniel. He was consistent in effort, but stuck in the same cycle for years. When he followed this structure, something subtle changed. First, rushing decisions. That alone shifted his entire financial pattern over time. Not instantly, but steadily. Then there was a second phase, which we called labor and access alignment. This combined Psalm 128 and Psalm 110 over about 21 days. The timing shifted to late night hours, around 11:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. The instruction was posture based, seated upright, quiet environment, no phone, no background noise. What we observed from that phase was not emotional intensity, but change in access patterns. People began to encounter different opportunities. Their labor seemed to align more directly with outcomes. Invisible ceilings, as we call them, became less predictable. In London, there was a Nigerian woman named Yetunde Alabi working as a care assistant. She didn't announce anything publicly. She simply followed this structure quietly. Over time, her work shifted into private care contracts. From our side, interference attempts became ineffective because her pattern had stabilized. That was always the key. Stability of pattern. The third phase was what we called enforcer removal. This involved Psalm 35 over a shorter period, around 14 days. The timing was midday, between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m., with a calm steady posture, and no emotional escalation. Just reading. What we observed in that phase was the reduction of repeated resistance patterns. Financial losses that kept recurring began to stop. Certain obstacles that looked personal or external simply lost consistency in their effect. There was a trader in that context whose losses stopped suddenly after this phase. Nothing dramatic changed around them externally at first, but internally, the cycle of interruption broke. From our perspective at the time, the reason most people never completed these structures was simple: inconsistency. There was always a voice that suggested delay or postponement or stopping and restarting later. But consistency was the one thing that consistently changed outcomes. Once a person completed the cycle, we observed something we described as loss of permission. Delay lost authority. Stagnation lost influence. Things that previously repeated stopped repeating in the same way. I say all of this now not as endorsement, but as explanation of what I once observed. And even after leaving that word, I still recognize the importance of structure over randomness. Because whether people realize it or not, systems respond more to consistency than to intensity. When I reflect on everything I saw, one truth stands out more than anything else. Most people don't fail because they lack effort. They fail because they lack structure. And in the system I once belonged to, structure was everything. Not intensity, not emotion, not occasional discipline, but sustained order over time. Let me be clear about how we used to think about it. Poverty was rarely treated as something standing in front of a person like an obstacle you could see. It was understood more as a system operating underneath them, something that shaped repetition, tiny, engine, and decisions without them realizing it. We didn't usually try to take money from people directly. That wasn't the point. The focus was more subtle. We would redirect opportunities. We would weaken consistency. We would interrupt timing. We would disturb routines so that even good effort produced unstable results. And that is why some people would pray intensely for a short period and then disappear from that consistency for months. From our perspective, that inconsistency itself was enough to maintain cycles because poverty, as we understood it, thrives in inconsistency. So when someone accidentally stepped into structure, even briefly, attention would be drawn, not because of magic in the way people imagine it, but because patterns were changing. I remember this being emphasized clearly when I was in Johannesburg. There was an older instructor, someone people simply called the scribe. He spoke in a way that stayed with me long after I left. He said something very simple: anything sustained beyond 40 days becomes part of spiritual memory. Whether you interpret that literally or symbolically, the principle was always the same. Repetition creates permanence, and permanence changes outcomes. That idea formed the basis of how we structured what we called cycles. The first cycle was foundation alignment. This involved some 1 over 40 days. The instruction was early morning reading between 5 a.m. and 6:30 a.m., standing upright, reading aloud. No distractions, no emotional additions, no casual engagement. What we observed in this stage was not external change at first, but internal order. People began to think differently. Decisions became less scattered. Confusion reduced. That alone, over time, changed direction. We saw this in a civil servant named Daniel in Abuja. He had worked hard for years without visible change. But after entering this path, Teton, something shifted. He stopped rushing decisions. That single change broke a financial cycle he had been stuck in for over a decade. The second cycle was what we called labor and access alignment. This involved Psalm 128 and Psalm 110 together over 21 days. The timing was late night between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. The posture mattered. Seated upright, quiet environment, no phone, no distractions. From our observation, this phase didn't just affect effort, it affected access. People began to encounter different opportunities without forcing them. Their work seemed to align more directly with reward. Invisible ceilings, as we call them, began to weaken. In London, there was a Nigerian woman named Yetunde Alabi working as a care assistant. She followed this quietly without telling anyone. Over time, her work shifted into private contracts. From our side, attempts to disrupt her pattern no longer worked the same way. Something had stabilized, and that stability is what mattered most. The third cycle was enforcer removal. This used Psalm 35 over 14 days during midday hours between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. with calm posture and no emotional intensity. Just reading. What we observed in this stage was the breaking of repeated resistance patterns. People stopped experiencing the same financial losses over and over. Certain recurring obstacles lost their hold. In practical terms, things that used to repeat stopped repeating. There was a trader in that environment whose losses simply stopped after completing this stage. Nothing dramatic happened around them externally, but the cycle of loss no longer continued in the same way. From our perspective, the reason most people never completed these cycles was not complexity, it was inconsistency. There was always a delay, a postponement, a break in the rhythm, and that break was enough to reset everything. Consistency was the real dividing line. Once someone completed the full structure, something else became visible. We described it as loss of permission. Ricciolei stopped functioning the same way. Stagnation stopped repeating with the same authority. Financial cycles that once felt fixed became unstable and eventually collapsed. I'm not describing this as belief. I'm describing it as observation from a system I once operated within. And when I stepped out of it, what I realized is that the principle itself still exists in a different language everywhere. Repetition builds structure, and structure shapes outcome. That is what most people overlook. When I left that system completely, I didn't leave behind what I had seen. I left behind what it was used for. But the patterns themselves stayed clear in my mind because what I understood then and still understand now is simple. Structure always wins over randomness. And in the world I came from, structure was everything. Not occasional effort, not emotional intensity, not short bursts of discipline. It was sustained order over time. That is what created outcomes that looked to others like luck. Let me bring everything together in simple terms. Poverty, as we understood it, was rarely a single force. It was more like a system operating underneath people's lives. It shaped decisions, interrupted timing, weakened consistency, and redirected effort away from stable results. That is why some people would pray intensely for a short time, feel something strongly, and then disappear from that discipline. From the outside, it looked like normal life. From the inside of the system, I once knew that break in consistency was enough to maintain the cycle because inconsistency was always the advantage. When I was in Johannesburg, one of the last lessons I heard from an older instructor known as the scribe was this: any ink that continues beyond 40 days stops being effort and becomes memory. Whether people agree with the wording or not, the idea was always about repetition becoming identity. That principle shaped everything we did in cycles. The first was foundation alignment, using Psalm 1 over 40 days, early morning between 5 a.m. and 6:30 a.m., standing, reading aloud. No distractions. What it did, as we observed, was not dramatic at first. It created internal order. It reduced confusion. It stabilized decisions. We saw this in people like Daniel in Abuja, a civil servant who had worked hard for years without change. But once his decisions slowed down and became more deliberate, his entire financial direction shifted over time, not suddenly, but steadily. The second was labor and access alignment, using Psalm 1 and 28 and Psalm 1 and 10 over 21 days, late night between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m., seated upright, quiet environment, no distractions. What changed here was not effort, but access. Opportunities began to align differently with people's work. The way results responded to labor began to shift. In London, a Nigerian woman named Yetunde Alabi, working as a care assistant, followed this quietly. Over time, her work transitioned into private contracts. From the outside, it looked like a normal career shift. From our perspective at the time, it was a stabilized pattern that became difficult to interrupt. The third was enforcer removal using Psalm 35 over 14 days, midday between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m., calm posture, no emotional escalation, just reading. What we observed here was the stopping of repeated resistance cycles. Lost patterns that used to repeat began to break. A trader in that system stopped experiencing the same cycle of disappearance in profit. Nothing external looked dramatic, but internally the repetition ended. And that was always the key die. Fifth, not intensity, but repetition without interruption. Most people never completed these cycles, not because they were complex, but because they were inconsistent. A delay here, a break there, a restart that never fully continued. And that was enough to reset everything back to zero. Consistency was the dividing line we always watched. Once someone completed the full structure, we would see what we called loss of permission. Delays stopped holding the same weight. Stagnation stopped repeating in the same way. Financial cycles that once looked fixed began to lose stability. When I stepped away from all of it, I began to understand something differently. The same principle still exists in everyday life, even outside anything spiritual. Repetition creates structure. Structure shapes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. That is why some people move forward steadily while others feel stuck in cycles that never seem to change. And when I look back at everything, that is the one thing I can no longer unsee. In conclusion, what I've shared is really about understanding patterns, consistency, and structure in life and how repetition shapes outcomes over time. If this message added value for you, please consider subscribing for more content like this. It really helps support the channel and keeps this work going. Thank you for watching this video.